Hello and welcome to this video. We were continuing the second chapter of your history, New Kings and Kingdoms. In last video, we discussed up to how the new dynasties emerged into power. And in this video, we will discuss about how kings were administrating their states. Administration in the kingdoms. Many new kings adopted high sounding titles such as Maharaja Adhiraja, Tribhuvana Chakravartin, etc. Like the Samantas or the subordinates started entitling themselves with great sounding titles like Mahasamanta, Mahamandaleswara. The kings were also entitling themselves with great sounding titles like Maharaja Adhiraja, Tribhuvana Chakravartin, etc. The literal meaning of those high sounding titles were like Maharaja Adhiraja means great king or overlord of king, whereas Tribhuvana Chakravartin literally means lord of the three worlds, that is Swarga, Martya and Patala in Sanskrit. So the king were very fancy about giving themselves great titles. But in spite of considering themselves great and so honorable, one good thing about them is that they often shared their power with their samantas, association of peasants, association of traders, association of brahmanas, and other associations also. Well, association means a group of people who generally form rule and regulations and look after the benefits of their own community. So the kings of late 7th century, they often entitle themselves with great sounding titles but share their power with samantas and other associations. Sometimes these were claimed as rent due to a lord who asserted that he owned the land. Like in last video we discussed that in order to administer their kingdom, the kings were often collecting a part of or a share of production from the producers. So sometimes the kings were collecting the resource which were sometimes also known as the rent. The landowners or the landlords often provide a part of their share to the king, which were also known as rent, and revenue were also collected from different trader, like who produces something they submitted a part of their production, but who were traders, they often submit a part of their money which were called revenues. Now we will see that what is the importance of revenue. The resources which were collected by the kings were used to finance the king's establishment. What kind of establishment? The resources or the revenue collected by the king were used for construction of temples, construction of forts, also used to fight wars. Those wars were committed or those wars were led in order to acquire more wealth from the plunder. Like whoever won the war. Obviously, a war always fought between two groups, and whoever won had a fair chance to capture the wealth of the land he just won. So, kings were often indulged in war in order to acquire more wealth from the land they won and plunder it, means loot it, then access to new land and access to trade routes. And for this purpose, like to acquire more wealth, to access new land and to access trade routes, kings were often indulging in wars, and those wars were funded from the revenue they collected. The revenue collector were generally from influential families and positions were often hereditary. The person who were assigned with the duty of collecting revenue on behalf of king were generally belong to influential families, means powerful families or families who were close to the kings, and the position of the revenue collector were hereditary, means if a person is collecting revenue for the king, there is a high chance that his son in future will get his position, then his son will get his position, and so on. That is called hereditary. This was true about the army as well. And not only the position of the revenue collector was hereditary, but the position of army were also hereditary. Means if someone's ancestor were serving in king's army, there is a high chance that that person might also get a position in the army of the king. In many cases, close relatives of king held this position. In many instances of various dynasties, it is found that the positions like revenue collector and higher position in armies were often held by the close relatives of the kings. Next is Prasastis and land grants. Well, you must have idea that what is the meaning of Prasasti. Let me remind you, in case you need help, that Prasasti is a kind of inscription on solid surface and mainly rocks. This is an example of Prasasti. Prasastis tell us how rulers wanted to depict themselves as valiant, victorious warriors, for example. So, Prasastis were a description about a king, his characteristic mainly, and good words that can describe a king. So, Prasastis were often written in praise of king. So, in many Prasasti, it is found that the Prasastis describing whoever king were often praising the king, like how valiant they were, how victorious they were, how a good warrior they were, or how a good ruler they were, like that. And these Prasastis were often composed by learned person. And you already had a fair idea that in ancient time not everyone has equal access to learning. Not everyone had a fair chance of getting access to education. In ancient time, the only learned people were either kings or brahmanas, and mainly brahmanas. The kings were learning, but they generally learned about the fighting skills. The people who learned about Vedas, writing Vedas, were mainly Brahmanas. So, it is very obvious that during those times, the Prasastis were often written by Brahmanas, and as the Prasastis were generally written in praise of king, so many a time kings also get pleased with their praises, and they often gifted those Brahmanas with lots of wealth. Kings often rewarded Brahmanas by grants of land, and they rewarded the Brahmanas with open arm. They often granted those Brahmanas lands, and these were recorded on copper plates which were given to those who received the land. And the records of the reward were recorded on copper plates. At that time, in copper plates, it was clearly recorded that this Brahmana is rewarded by the king with this land, and that plate was given to the Brahmana who received the land grant from the king as a reward for writing a prasasti in praise of the king. Unusual for 12th century was a long Sanskrit poem containing the history of kings who ruled over Kashmir. It is very unusual, but in 12th century there was a Sanskrit poem which contains the history of kings who ruled over the Kashmir. It was composed by an author named Kalhan, and Kalhan knows about all those history of those kings from various sources like inscriptions, documents, eyewitness accounts, and earlier histories. From those sources, he composed a poem about the kings of Kashmir. That's all about this video. Thank you.